It was neither technology nor directly the Roman effort to pacify the Mediterranean that made possible the Roman sea trade network. Classical era nautical technology was already established by the time the Roman Empire had secured control of the Mediterranean, and the pacification helped cheapen sea trade, but only that. So the real short answer is the grain dole of Rome. That is it. The scale and sophistication of the Roman sea trade was a direct result of imperial subsidies. The size of the Roman grain ships came about from imperial demand. The imperial government simply paid to have its grain and olive oil transported to Rome herself and other large receiving metropolises. The cargo was thus never the property of the owner of the ship, but of the government that hired the ship, which is very akin to how shipping works today. As such, the Roman shipping system was not about traders going out to buy products in one place to transport it to another and sell it for profit. The profit was being paid simply to move goods for others, and the single dominant other was the imperial government moving resources around the empire. Other sea traders existed, but they were side notes to government shipping. The ship owners were private, however. They earned money by transporting the goods of the imperial government from the place of origin to the place of consumption, sometimes with places of processing in between. And the government demand of the shippers was simple. How cheaply can you bring grain from the imperial grain dole from the ports of Egypt and North Africa to Rome? This directly necessitated bulk volume cargo, with the sea being the only option for such transport. It also meant that only shippers with the resources to set very large ships to sea had the possibility to bid on imperial cargoes. The ships needed to be very large, and this required large amounts of capital. This did not mean that smaller cargo ships did not operate in the Roman Mediterranean, but these would ferry cargo that had much higher value to weight and volume, and this would have been with or without the Roman Empire, as this was only present before Rome acquired its dominant position. What did arise with the empire was the very large-scale bulk cargo transport, which in turn also required much larger port facilities to handle the large grain ships. Again, these large ports were also built by the imperial government rather than private enterprises. Athens had also had a large grain fleet prior to the Romans to supply themselves with much needed grain to support the Athenian population, which grew larger than would be supported locally. But this was much smaller than the later Roman, which would dwarf it in scale, and where the Athenians traded goods both ways, as they did not conquer Egypt, the Roman transport was much more one way, as the grain was basically Roman taxes paid in grain from Egypt and Africa. So, the movement of the grain and other bulk products around the Mediterranean was basically the taxes being distributed inside the empire. This to a large extent meant going to Rome and other imperially supported metropolises. Rome and Italy had undergone a very strong urbanization from Republican times, and the Italian farmlands had been bought up by the Roman upper class for villas farmed by slaves. These villas usually had extensive cattle farming rather than grain farming, leaving Italy with a near permanent internal grain shortage. At the same time, the urbanized population in Rome had a large segment of destitute citizens with only one real bargaining chip left, their voting rights as Roman citizens. From Republican times, this led to a large segment of the population voting for politicians who would keep them fed. So a politician would seek election by handing out generously to the constituents. Basically, Rome transformed into a system where the politician bribed the voters into voting for them. In imperial times, this became the same for the emperors, who would be measured on their ability to deliver bread and circus for the citizens. The only way to fund this welfare system was by using grain taxes from the provinces to heavily subsidize grain, and later simply handing it out freely to the citizens of Rome, under the emperor's provinces, like Egypt, directly under the emperor's ownership, became sources for the emperor's handouts. It should be noted that access to grain dole and other Roman welfare programs were not viewed as shameful. Contrary, it was seen as a privilege and a simply inalienable right of the citizens who had access to it. Thus, the Republican senators and later the emperors would pay shippers of the equestrian class to transport the physical grain and similar products like olive oil from the provinces they controlled to Rome to hand out to the citizens, either for free or below cost, not only to ensure their continued popularity, but also because it was viewed as their duty to do so. Even the emperor was until the late Roman Empire viewed as the first citizens of the Republic and thus obligated to service his fellow citizens' rights. So the emperor, to a large extent, took over the handing out of bread, olive oil and wine, as well as the public works and circus events that had been expected of the senatorial class when holding office during the pre-imperial republic. And as the number of Roman citizens increased and Rome grew to about 1 million souls, the demand on the emperor to supply the requirements only grew. This meant that the ships only grew and grew to accommodate the needs. The main Roman grain carrier, or navis granariae, would be a large version of the corvita, which was a Greek transport ship and had been in common use since Hellenistic times. It was a single-masted ship with steering oars and a rounded raised stern to protect from waves from behind, as it was square-rigged and would sail with the wind from the rear. It would also usually carry a small square sail mounted on the bowsprit, which is the horizontal mast at the bow of the ship. The Greek ships were smaller than what the Romans would later build, but the design remained the same, just larger. A swan neck and a head at the stern would also be common as an ornament. The Romans would develop a number of specialized versions of the corvita, specialized here meaning furnished for specific cargoes, not anything special in its seaworthiness. The navis granariae would be the huge grain carriers supplying Rome with grain for bread and porridge. These would become huge in size. Isis, a wreckage discovered off the coast of Sicily in 1989, was measured to 55 meters or 180 feet in length and a beam of 13.7 meters or 55 feet. That is the width at the widest part of the ship. Cargo hold had a depth of 13.4 meters or 44 feet and could carry 1,100 metric tons. This is a huge size for ancient times and was almost certainly carrying grain to Rome herself, as Ostia, the port of Rome, could handle ship of that size. Just to give a comparison, a standard corvita would only be 25 to 30 meters long and had a beam of 8 to 10 meters with a cargo capacity between 60 and 300 metric tons, with most being around 100 to 150 metric tons. The difference is thus quite huge, and the largest grain carriers, as stated, would be limited to only the largest ports available in the Roman Empire. But as trade in the Roman world was predominantly done by sea, there needed to be sizes for lesser ports too. To put it into perspective, the city of Rome needed no less than 400,000 metric tons of grain each year. That would mean that on average, at least one Isis-sized corvita would need to dock in Ostia every day, and as sailing was limited during the winter season due to dangerous weather, the sailing season would more average at least 2 a day, and the route between Egypt and Ostia would be at least 20 days plus. This shows just how many Isis-class corvitae would be needed to keep Rome fed just with grain. Besides this came all the other goods needed. In the huge grain carriers, the grain would be transported in amphorae, which was the shipping container of antiquity and also adopted from Greeks and Phoenicians by the Romans. These amphorae would also be produced in huge numbers at the point of export under imperial procurement to transport the goods efficiently. Usually this would be a one-way trip, as it was cheaper to have new produced at the site than transporting the empty amphorae back. The most extreme example of this is Monte Testaccio in Rome, which is a hill composed of broken amphorae from the delivery of only olive oil to Rome. The oil meant that the amphorae could not be reused for anything, so they were crushed and neatly deposited here. Grain amphorae could be used for other purposes, but would be available in large numbers in the receiving regions. Other specialized large corpitae would be the navis lapidariae that were internally enforced to carry marble. Again, these existed for public works, as these were by far the major users of marble. Only the wealthiest private people could afford marble in their housing. Navis venariae were specialized wine transporters that would be built with huge up to 3,000-liter casks for the transport of wine in bulk. The wine could then be filled into wine amphorae at the point of import for the final leg of the journey to the consumer. Again, large carriage of wine was often to supply large population centers like Rome or imperial officials and soldiers in the provinces, as the local populations usually used their own local produce and sold surpluses for the imperial government when possible, when it was not simply the tax they paid. So the Roman maritime development led to a number of specializations in the cargo hold to accommodate the requirement of the imperial government and politicians, gaining popularity by handing out bread and circus, as well as making large-scale public works for the city. These specializations only came about due to the very significant demand for specialized transport that the Roman political system created. The Roman sea trade system was thus heavily dependent on the financing constantly coming from transport orders from the imperial government itself. Much like the Roman road network that was built for the purpose of the imperial government and army, but made traveling easier for commoners, so too was the maritime transport system a result of the imperial demand for transport of its own physical goods across the empire, which had the added effect of making travel in the empire easier. An example of this is Apostle Paul, who traveled extensively at sea. The Roman Empire did not have passenger ferry systems. Commoners would simply pay to travel along aboard commercial ships, and this was exactly what Apostle Paul did. He found a ship going in his general direction and paid the captain to come along. This was common in the Roman Empire, and due to the large number of ships, it became much easier to travel. This means that to an extent the Roman government indirectly subsidized travel within the empire by paying for the transport of its own goods of such magnitude that it kept the large sea trade network of the Roman Mediterranean afloat. It was all about subsidizing the very large cities that grew forth as an effect of the Roman system, which continuously led to urbanization around the main imperial hubs and especially at the central hub of Rome herself. It simply became much cheaper to feed these large city hubs by sea from the most fertile bread baskets of the empire than having it collected from less fertile farmland with more difficult transportation. This had the effect of undercutting the price of local produce, leading to increased urbanization from the countryside that could not compete, leading to a larger demand for subsidized grain, as these new urban dwellers were Roman citizens who could vote and voted for those that kept them fed. This circle quietly built the Roman sea trade network to the very large extent that it reached in the 2nd century AD, and a steady income from government transport led to the shippers being comfortable enough to carry the cost of building ever larger, more specialized ships that could only go to ports in specific large imperial ports built for the purpose. The depopulated rural areas would then be bought up by the senatorial class to make large villa estates with extensive cattle farming run by slaves. The cattle had low overland transport costs, as it could be driven into the city for slaughter by a limited number of slaves, thus being cost competitive with ships. All in all, this shows a Roman sea trade coming about as the political elite constantly had to bribe the Roman citizens into voting for them, and during Republican times, the senator who handed out the most usually won the office that would lead to a provincial assignment that could be used to finance more handouts to once again being elected to office. So, an aspiring senator would often have an entourage from the equestrian class around them to offer their services like shipping. What becomes clear is how it was the needs of the Roman government and the governmental class that shaped the Roman sea trade. The simple need for handouts that became embedded in the Roman politics necessitated the large-scale transport of base goods across the empire. It was thus not as much private demand that drove the development of the Roman sea trade as it was political demand for bread and circus. This even went as far as to the Roman imports, as the large animal trade into the empire was largely driven by the needs of the public spectacles in the circuses. Even the far-off Roman trade post on the Canary Islands to produce purple dye was for a color reserved for the uppermost political class. So, although the Roman governmental system made massive use of private contractors for almost any service, including the shipping, these were almost all ultimately dependent upon the government demand for services rather than private demand. Private demand would be a side note that became more affordable due to the huge government demand, but that basically made the services used by private people subsidized, as they were only available due to the size of government demand. And although the large corvée that transported the goods across the empire were privately owned, their number and size were dependent on the government building the ports that could receive them. So too was the cheapness of the food of the sailors subsidized produce that the sailors themselves bought between the large Roman ports to feed the urbanized population dependent on the government grain. This all shows how the Roman sea trade system was ultimately dependent on grain dole and other handouts, and therefore the sea trade would also reduce significantly as the government demand structure reduced and in some places vanished in the late empire. As the cities deurbanized, the need for bulk food transport reduced, leading to higher transport costs, leading to more deurbanization, leading to less demand for bulk transport, reducing the size of the ships. The Roman sea trade network was a direct consequence of the massive urbanization of the empire and fully dependent on large urbanized areas. One could say that the size of Rome decided the size of Roman cargo ships.